elevated risk of myocarditis, inflammation of the heart, as the price of a college education. Many, faced with these anti-scientific choices, will never trust public health authorities again, and I know this because they write to me and tell me that. Even on such vital topics as the necessity of traditional childhood vaccines, there is a collapse in public confidence in public health. The measles outbreaks we've seen in Western Europe, in Africa, in the Americas, including the most recent one in Florida, are all fruits, I think, of this denial of basic scientific facts. I've spoken with many parents who very reasonably ask me, if public health officials were so wrong about the COVID vaccines for my kids, how can I trust them on other vaccines? It's disheartening because I know how important, as someone who works in public health, I know how important childhood vaccines like the measles, the MMR vaccines are to the health and well-being of children. Public health and bureaucrats and government officials operate more like dictators than scientists during the pandemic, sealing themselves off from credible outside criticism. Consider, for instance, the treatment of scientific dissidents outside the government who contradicted public health dogma. In the earliest days of the pandemic, public health bureaucrats organized a cover-up of the hypothesis that COVID emerged due to a laboratory leak, calling scientists who proposed the ideas conspiracy theorists and racists. Only recently have official bodies started to admit that the theory is plausible, and actually I would go further, I think it's very likely true, although there's still controversy in the scientific community about that. It is certainly not a conspiracy theory, and it's a vitally important question because if it was a lab leak, then the kinds of activities that led to the lab leak, the supporting of that kind of research, is something we can concretely do to minimize or to reduce the risk of future pandemics caused by similar mechanisms. Where do the scientists whose careers were destroyed by advancing this idea, this critically important idea to get right, where do they go to get their reputations back? When Martin Kulldorff of Harvard, I already mentioned him, Sunetra Gupta, professor of theoretical epidemiology at Oxford University, she's one of the most important epidemiologists in the world. And I proposed a focused protection alternative to lockdowns in October 2020. We called it the Great Barrington Declaration. On October 4th, 2020, we wrote this, put it online. Almost 1 million people signed it. And tens of thousands of doctors signed it, tens of thousands of scientists signed it, including a Nobel Prize winner. 4 days after we wrote the declaration, the head of the National Institute of Health, Francis Collins, the US National Institute of Health, wrote an email to Tony Fauci calling the three of us fringe epidemiologists, a term that showed up in news story after news story in places like the Washington Post, and then engaged a media censorship campaign, a media campaign to conduct what he called a devastating takedown of the premises of the declaration. Remember, tens of thousands of scientists and doctors had signed on to this because I knew they had reached out to me that there was no consensus on lockdown. One of the primary reasons we wrote the declaration was to tell the public that there was a massive debate going on among scientists and epidemiologists about the wisdom and efficacy of lockdowns. Under the banner of combating misinformation, the government health agencies use their power to collaborate with social media to control the public conversation about COVID science and policy to the detriment of the poor everywhere. This was an enormous abuse of power by Collins. As the head of the NIH, his agency controls the funding and professional standing of nearly every biomedical scientist of note in the US, and many worldwide. I personally have enjoyed NIH funding for nearly my entire career. In fact, because I'm a tenured faculty member at Stanford Medicine, one of the reasons why is because I've been successful in my career at gaining NIH grants. When Collins directed his devastating takedown of the Great Barrington Declaration, he was sending an unmistakable signal to other scientists and epidemiologists: fall in line with his lockdown policy or else face excommunication from the scientific community. Many people who signed the declaration lost their jobs, some in university settings. Many of them faced retribution in the form of broken relationships and opportunities to sign up to promote grants. It was an act of courage to sign the declaration itself, at least publicly. On March 18th, 2021, Dr. Scott Atlas of Stanford University, a colleague of mine, Dr. Kulldorff, Dr. Gupta, and I participated in a 2-hour roundtable with Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida, March 18, 2021. During the discussion, the participants, including me, questioned the efficacy and appropriateness of requiring children to wear face masks. Just to give you one data point on this, the US CDC recommended masking 2-year-olds. The World Health Organization did not recommend masking anyone under 6, and the European CDC did not recommending masking anyone under 12. As you can see just from that fact, there was tremendous scientific disagreement about the efficacy of masking children. And there was good reason for that, because there are no randomized trials assessing whether masking children has any efficacy on the spread of respiratory viruses. I told the governor this publicly in the roundtable, and there was a TV station that filmed me telling the governor this. The roundtable discussion was promptly censored on social media. YouTube pulled down the video of a TV station, where the TV station was showing the public the scientific advice that a sitting governor was getting. They pulled the video down, claiming it contradicts the consensus of local and global health authorities regarding the efficacy of masks to prevent the spread of COVID. But that itself was a lie, because as I told you what the consensus was, the European CDC said no masking children under 12, whereas the US CDC says mask children as young as 2. Notably, the opposite is now true. Doubting the efficacy of masks, especially cloth masks, is, if anything, the new consensus. The pattern repeated itself throughout the pandemic. Scientific bureaucrats abused their authority to create an illusion of consensus in favor of destructive ideas where none actually existed. The censorship of scientific discussion permitted a policy environment where clear scientific truths were muddled. As a result, ineffective, destructive policies persisted much longer than they otherwise would have. According to documents found in the Missouri versus Biden case, where I'm a plaintiff, the Biden administration insisted on censoring and deboosting content that accurately pointed out the rapidly waning efficacy of the COVID vaccine against infections that they used to justify orders to impose vaccine mandates. The Biden administration pressured Facebook to censor vaccine discussions, such as groups of vaccine-injured patients, legitimately injured patients, that did not violate Facebook's community standard. In response to harsh communications of the Biden administration advisor Andy Slavitt in 2021, Facebook limited the reach of these groups and censored them, essentially gaslighting them into thinking that no one believed that they were actually injured by the vaccines, including cases of myocarditis, which everyone admits happens from the COVID vaccine. The evidentiary record in the Missouri versus Biden case, which includes 8 hours of testimony from Tony Fauci telling the court he does not recall in answer to basic scientific questions 174 times, I strongly recommend you go read the evidentiary record, because you will leave shocked at that an American government could engage in this kind of censorship activity. The irony is that the government itself was also the primary source of misinformation during the pandemic. In May 2022, the US Surgeon General released a public call to identify misinformation about COVID. Along with Martin Kulldorff and the Indiana Attorney General, we sent a response in which we identified 9 specific areas where the primary source of misinformation was the government itself. The topics included ignoring many facts. The fact that the risk of COVID is deeply age stratified. Are we all equally at risk from COVID? That recovery from COVID provides immunity, that the COVID vaccines don't stop disease transmission, that school closures were not warranted, that there was alternatives to lockdown, or that the mask blocked disease transmission, and many other topics. So how did the government accomplish this feat of censorship despite nominal protections of free speech? Well, they did it in 2 steps. First, they launder the development of a particular agenda for censorship. They create lists of people of who and what to censor. And the laundering is by third parties that are not themselves prohibited from such activities, from essentially asking social media companies to censor, in the guise of funding research. Government agencies funded universities and NGOs to support these enterprises, including my own home institution on a project called the Stanford Virality Project. They funded the Center for Countering Digital Hate. The idea was to create target lists for administration censorship efforts. These organizations receive tips from the public and the government itself about stakeholders to construct their hit list for censorship. In essence, they serve as proxies for the government to exert their control over big tech. Second, with government backing, these public entities, linked sometimes to prominent universities, as I said, Stanford, but also University of Washington and others, work with corporate teams and social media companies' trust and safety divisions to pressure social media companies to censor the offending speech. They often use AI algorithms to identify speech marked for censorship so that you don't even need a human to identify it. And then governments are directly involved in the step, meeting regularly with social media company employees to reinforce the censorship demands. They always implicitly and sometimes explicitly threaten regulatory action to harm the social media companies that do not comply. Ironically, the government itself was harmed by this. At one point in April of 2021, the government, the US CDC issued a warning about the J&J vaccine. Remember that? They paused the Johnson & Johnson vaccine because they'd found a signal of elevated risk of clotting in women. Martin Kulldorff actually, this is what actually officially led to him being fired from the CDC. He wrote an op-ed saying that the statistical signal was not actually accurate, that there wasn't enough information to warrant a pause. The CDC fired him. In the Missouri versus Biden documents, what we found was that the Facebook had applied the filter of anti-vax that the Biden administration had ordered Facebook to create, and it had found the White House to be an anti-vax group for sharing the CDC post saying that the J&J vaccine needed to be paused. And so you have the White House sending outraged messages to Facebook saying, why have you suppressed us? And then Facebook coming back and saying, well, sheepishly saying, well, we identified you as an anti-vax group. We're at a crossroads, and the whole of the scientific community needs to understand the stakes, because I think that the suppression of scientific ideas and debate will not die as the pandemic ends. Science depends on an environment where scientists feel entirely free to put forward and test ideas counter to what most scientists think. Dogma is anathema to science. Our greatest scientific heroes are those who stood up to establish scientific ideas and replace them with better ones. As Mario reminded us about Karl Popper, if a scientific idea is not falsifiable, it's not a scientific idea at all. So every scientific idea is necessarily provisional and subject to the risk of being overturned as new data, experiments, and ideas arise. Science needs challenge. So it's no accident that the Enlightenment took full bloom after the emergence of the Gutenberg press. It made it much more difficult for the authorities of the day to suppress speech of scientists and thinkers. While then, the greatest threat was probably from clerical authorities who had the power to decree scientific truth from above and silence scientific conversation. The danger now is from powerful scientific bureaucrats, men like Tony Fauci, men like Francis Collins, with the power to propagandize the population and excommunicate inconvenient heretics with devastating takedowns. In the face of this, scientists will silence themselves rather than face vicious smearing and slander. I've lost track of how many emails from scientists written to me thanking me for continuing to speak because they themselves thought that they would face too great a cost for doing so. At the heart of the pandemic, Harvard professor and fellow Great Barrington Declaration author Martin Kulldorff declared the end of the Enlightenment in face of scientific censorship. All that's needed for a scientific topic to become important to the public, and then the censorship engine will kick in, and it'll guarantee that no good and honest science can be done on the topic. Only on the most important topics of the day where we desperately need science, that's where censorship will be most at play. As things stand, the situation regarding free speech is dire in the Western world. While in the US, the Missouri versus Biden case, currently under consideration by the US Supreme Court, we have a hearing on March 18th, an oral hearing in front of the Supreme Court. That is vitally important. It has the promise to limit the government's power to censor. However, in the UK, Canada, the EU have enshrined these powers into law. I heard a lot of support for the idea that the US can serve as a model for the rest of the world. Well, the rest of the world needs us to stand up for our values of free speech because the rest of the world is headed in the wrong direction. I think without a concerted political program to reverse these laws in the Western world and to restore free speech in the United States, the promise that the internet once held to stoke a second enlightenment as much broader even than the first, which followed from the introduction of the printing press, well, it'll be nothing but a dream of the 1450s and the 1990s. Thank you.
So this is very exciting, and we only have a few minutes. As Mario mentioned, we want to try and get back on schedule into our programming, and I also want to leave a couple of minutes for questions from the audience if we can fit that in.
So we can go to 1:40 with.
So okay, so I just have a few questions that I want to cover, and of course, we'd like to bring this discussion into a couple of different realms, including climate, of which you are an expert now after 2 days of studying the climate at this seminar. But let's go in first. Let's stick with health. And you and I were talking about this earlier, so I'd be curious on your points. You make some really compelling arguments about the power of censorship, the damage it can do. Yet, we have a situation right now in Manatee Bay Elementary School in Fort Lauderdale, trying to keep it local, as Susan Glickman told me, instructed me to do. There's currently a measles outbreak there. It's near Fort Lauderdale. And the Florida Surgeon General, Joseph Ladapo, is not urging parents to keep their unvaccinated children home. He's not saying they're obviously free to do whatever you want, and you should make your own decision. He's keeping the power with the parents. But science says that up to 90% of people exposed to an infected person will contract measles. These are people who are not vaccinated. And there's a reason that these kids, that a portion of these students and these kids are not vaccinated, and that is because of COVID and the pandemic. The MMR virus, as we were discussing, has some history with being blamed for causing incidences of autism as well, but clearly this has spiked during the pandemic. And a drop below a 95% vaccination rate, which comprises herd immunity, 95%, will lead to big problems. Florida's state coverage is now 90%, 5 percentage points below that 95% herd immunity. And for those I'm sure Dr. J could tell us, measles is a big deal. It can be very dangerous for children and anyone, in fact. All sorts of different encephalitis type syndromes, as well as pneumonia, which is a primary killer of children as well. So this is very important. 1 in 20 children who contract measles develop pneumonia, leading cause of death, and many other complications. Is the Surgeon General in Florida, in your view, correct in following this protocol, which is an open, I would say, ascribes to the you make your choice and selection on this, or should he be more focused and heavy-handed on demanding that unvaccinated children stay home for their own safety?
So I'm not the Surgeon General for Florida, obviously, which is thank goodness, because I'm just a fringe epidemiologist, it turns out. But I'll tell you, I think two things. One is you have to like think about a broader set of outcomes than just one disease. And that's one lesson we learned from COVID, right? So, and keeping kids home from school generally is a very bad thing. So I think that's probably what's going through his head. We've already recommended kids stay out of school for a very long time in much of the country, and that it's imposed cost on them. I don't know the particular epidemiological outbreak here, the epidemiological situation in the school here. It may be that almost all of the kids that are unvaccinated already got measles. I saw the estimate was like something like 6 kids already had measles.
That's correct.
Yeah, so I mean, it's possible that everyone who's at risk has already had it. I don't know the specifics of it. I think generally the recommendation I would do if I were in his shoes is, yes, bring your kids to school, but yes, also get them vaccinated if you haven't already had it. That's what I would suggest for measles. Measles is a disease that is severe in kids. It does cause encephalitis, absolutely. I think the death rate is 1 in 1,000 for kids, which is too high.
Yeah, that's correct.
So it's one of these things where, I should say like what's the reason for the collapse in the vaccination rates that we're seeing? Because vaccination rates they vary across the country. In my home state of California, before the pandemic, Marin County, a rich county, actually was the center for lack of vaccination. During the pandemic, I think that the major reason we're seeing this collapse in trust in vaccination among essential vaccines is because the public health authorities themselves sent a signal that these vaccinations were not important. The WHO and Gavi, which funds vaccination in Africa and poor countries, they stopped the measles vaccination efforts in those countries, saying essentially that COVID is more important than measles, even though measles is much worse for children than COVID. I mean, it was objectively the most anti-vax action I've ever seen taken by an organization of that sort. And so I think and a lot of parents now write to me saying that they don't trust any vaccines. It's because they don't trust public health. I don't know how, I think the key thing going forward then is not to tell kids to stay home from school. The key thing going forward is to work to regain the trust of parents about these essential vaccines. And I don't see how you do that until public health sort of engages in an active contrition, saying, look, we were wrong on X, Y, and Z, and re-engages with the public about this. Because I don't have an answer for parents who reach out to me. I mean, I can show them studies, but they won't believe me.
Very good. Mario, I'd love to take this question to you, actually, not as a health expert, but as the parent of a beautiful baby boy, Benny, who we saw last night. How do you feel about that pronouncement from the Surgeon General of Florida?
I don't know about the specific case that you laid out, but I will say that I took biochemistry in college, and I studied basic undergrad, immune systems and how they work and how vaccines are designed. And I am definitely a believer in vaccines. At least, I don't know about mRNA vaccines, but just the typical case of a vaccine that primes your immune system so that you don't have to have the full-blown immune response that takes several weeks while the disease just like wreaks havoc inside your body and jumps ahead. But I remember from my understanding of how vaccines work just from my college textbook, that the purpose of a vaccine is to prevent you from getting sick when you're infected. It can stop transmission of the virus, but that's not what vaccines do. And so when vaccines were being sold to the public when vaccine mandates were being justified to the public as a necessary measure to stop transmission of the disease, I was like, wait a second, that's not what I remember from college textbooks. And it turns out that Dr. Blix said herself that she thought all along, Birx said herself that she thought all along that she did not expect the new vaccines to slow down transmission of the virus. So, like a lot of people, a lot of my friends, I'm pro-vaccine, but anti-vaccine mandates.
Can I just jump in real
Please.
fast on that one point? Because this is really important. The vaccines that are approved for use have gone through substantial testing and continuously testing. And they get revised. So, for instance, the formulation of various vaccines, the MMR vaccine, for instance, has been changed over time as evidence comes in about safety, about efficacy, and so on. Those are the vaccines that are approved for use. There's lots of vaccines that are not approved for use. It's not that you shouldn't say all vaccines are right. The question is like, what evidence is there for the vaccines? The problem with the COVID vaccine was that you had a vaccine that had a limited amount of safety testing and efficacy testing before it was approved. It was an investigational vaccine, and yet it was mandated. There's a difference between that vaccine and the vaccines that have decades and decades of experience behind them. The reason why people think vaccines are safe and effective is because the ones that are approved generally are. The problem with the COVID vaccines is they were applying that label before the full data had come in, and they got things wrong. Like, for instance, Mario mentioned the efficacy against preventing disease transmission. They had no idea from the randomized trial because they didn't check whether it stopped disease transmission.
Where I was going with this was misinformation. So, and very good points. And just to share my own personal story, my sons are in their 20s now, but I did not give them the MMR vaccine when they were little because I have a beautiful niece who has autism, and my brother and sister-in-law were convinced that she had ingested mercury, which was a preservative used in the vaccines of the day. But that is the type of misinformation, and of course, ultimately, I did get them vaccinated. But that's that type of misinformation. When it comes to, is it blacklisting, is it editing, we're relying on people who have a certain level of intelligence to make these judgments on their own. And I think the question and debate is, where's government's role in trying to regulate, monitor, help in those decisions?
Well, and the danger of misinformation about vaccines is an equal opportunity. It's equal opportunity in terms of sources.
Indeed.
And what you said actually applies with even greater strength to misinformation about vaccines that's coming from government officials. Because if people didn't believe, I mean, I've always thought that the autism stuff, it turned out if I read about it that there wasn't anything behind it.
Debunked.
But on the efficacy of the vaccines and stuff, there were a lot of reasons to doubt. And now I know people who. And I definitely disagree with this. I mean, I know people who, at the height of all this stuff, when all these scandals were starting to come out, were saying we should disband CDC. And I was like, wait a second, wait. And these were people that I know, friends of mine that wrote a lot about the school closures from the point of view of parents. And these are not people who have any particular expertise in what CDC does. And so I pointed out, hey, CDC is not in the business of school lockdown policy. CDC is tracking diseases. Like, you can't throw out the baby with the bathwater just because CDC made recommendations on school closures that then politicians kind of hid behind. And I think that if there's a place for CDC recommendations, one thing is we've stressed the difference between risk management and risk assessment. CDC is in the business of risk assessment. The people who do risk management are the ones that have to make decisions based on CDC recommendations. Dr. Fauci did not order schools to close, right? Dr. Fauci made recommendations that then school board authorities and state authorities implemented, and to the extent that those things became unpopular, these politicians were hiding behind the skirt, so to speak, of the supposed experts. But I will even take issue with something that you said, that even if there was a scientific consensus, even if there had been a scientific consensus for school closures, that still would not have justified school closures on its own, because that kind of risk management is an inescapable political function.
Right. I mean, I would call that a necessary but not sufficient condition, right?
Yeah.
If you're going to require something extraordinary as school closures, you better have absolute scientific unanimity, and then you still have to do the assessment. I agree with that.
Indeed, I want to move into climate, if we could, real quickly from health.
Oh God!
And this is for
I was already canceled once. Andrew.
This is for both of you. No, we're gonna keep this at the level of censorship and misinformation and disinformation rather than the actual science itself. But there are obvious lessons here for fostering a more open discussion on climate change and the costs of mitigation. We've been talking about that for the past 2 days. So let's talk about climate scientist Michael Mann of the famous hockey stick. He recently won a court judgment against Mark Stein, the National Review writer, and Rand Simberg, a former scholar at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Richard, do you know him? Is he still there? No, good. Former scholar. They were found to be defaming Mann with false statements and comparisons to Jerry Sandusky. Mann is a Penn State professor. Jerry Sandusky, the pedophile, saying he molested data rather than children, so Little Arch. The trial marks one of the very few instances in American courts that a climate scientist had taken the stand to defend their research. And Mann has called it a victory for science. Do you agree?
I mean, I've been the subject by scientists of that kind of defamation. I've been called a eugenicist. I've been called, for arguing to protect vulnerable older people, I guess I'm a eugenicist. I've been attacked as a fringe epidemiologist by the head of the NIH, right? I think that this kind of sharp elbows, I don't see how you have, I mean, there's just the way people are, that you're gonna have these sharp elbows. I think that's really unfortunate. I think science should have the capacity to reason with each other. Scientists should have the capacity to reason with each other without these kinds of smearing and attacks. Whether the legal system is the right remedy for that, I don't know. I'm not sure. I didn't follow that case very, very closely. But if I could, Andrew, I have a list of like journalists, prominent journalists who attacked me, smeared me, attacked me in the most vile ways, completely outside the truth, who's with the main aim of silencing my scientific opinion.
Yeah, and
sounds like there could be $1 million in there for you.
I don't want
your cards right. And by the way, I just want to point out that I believe that Simberg, his quote or his attorney's quote at the end of this is that they did talk about his analysis of the data that was not impugned and was not seen to be slander or libel.
So by the way, that's a very good point that you raised, because there's an entire volume of the Annals of Statistics, a scholarly peer-reviewed journal devoted to the problems of Michael Mann's hockey stick modeling, right? I mean, this has been, and the IPCC itself has moved away from those numbers, as Obi and others have pointed out in this conference. The reason why, if you read Mark Stein and with the other CI fellow, these were like really terrible. They weren't saying, Michael Mann manipulated the science. They were like saying that he was like corrupt and calling him all kinds of things. And I mean, if everybody who made accusations of corruption or being owned by big oil or whatever was opening themselves up to a libel lawsuit, there are people in this room who would be in a lot of trouble, right? So these were impugning his character, not what he was saying about the science. None of the people that have criticized what Michael Mann was saying on the science, and there are a lot of them, have been subject to or have been prosecuted for libel successfully. What happened to Dr. Bhattacharya, on the other hand, was an orchestrated attempt to impugn not just his character, but the validity of what he was saying scientifically. And that's open to criticism. I mean, that's it's fair game, and I think your instinct is right that it shouldn't be, that kind of thing shouldn't be actionable. But I think that anyway, what happened to Michael Mann really seems to me like small compared to what happened to Dr.
Oh, I
Bhattacharya.
certainly am not making comparisons in terms of scale, whatsoever, but merely the fact that it was.
I mean, I think like the
brought to court.
one difference is like you have, I guess in the Michael Mann case, you had journalists or commentators attacking him.
Yeah.
Here you have the government top scientific bureaucrats attacking, not just, and it's not just substantive, but like I disagree with you on these scientific facts. It's I'm a fringe epidemiologist, like ad hominem attack, right?
Let's dig into government attacks. So, and we'll move away from climate for a moment. I just wanted to ask Jay one question and then a question to both of you. And then, by the way, I'd like to wrap our talk up in 5 minutes and then open the floor up to questions. So please think of your questions. I don't know if we have a handheld mic that we can pass around. So a year ago, you wrote in Tablet magazine that academic freedom at Stanford is dying. You argued that it's a critical element of scholarship and learning, and that Stanford failed that test. Do you feel similarly today? And you're still there, so my guess is no. Unless tenure is too good to turn down.
I almost left in 2020. As I said, I've been at Stanford almost 40 years, 25 years ago, almost 24 years as a professor. And I bought a Stanford sweatshirt in 1992, which I almost burned in 2020. But I actually am very hopeful actually now, Andrew. Things seem to be turning around.
At Stanford?
Yeah. There was a big scandal having nothing to do with me over somebody invited, someone in the law school invited a controversial federal judge, and then there was like a big, the head of the law school then wrote a letter standing up for free speech rights after the judge had been protested inappropriately, I think. And then there was a big scandal involving the president of the university, and he had to step down. And the new president was the former provost at University of Chicago, with a very firm commitment, it seems to me, to free speech and academic freedom. Things do seem to be turning around. I haven't had a death threat in 2 years.
So that's very unexciting, I guess, for you. You're sleeping well. So that's great to hear. Free speech is back at Stanford, on its way back.
I mean, I still have criticisms, but I'm a glass half full kind of guy. So
Good.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
it's turning around.
So let's lead into this then. Do you see parallels between what happened to you and what has happened to student groups protesting against Israel on campuses in the US? And I'll bring the government in here. Universities have suppressed their right to gather, a lot of these groups, after a ton of pressure. Initially, they did not react in this way. Bill Ackman and others have pushed to blacklist students in these groups, blacklist them publicly from gainful employment on Wall Street or wherever else he can influence with his bajillion Twitter followers. Very similar to how you maintain the government had a Twitter blacklist on you in place. Do you support the rights of these student groups to protest and express their opinions?
Yes. Yeah, I think it's healthy that they have the right to say what they think. I do think that there are concerns about. I mean, I've heard, for instance, some Jewish students who felt physically unsafe on campus, and I think that's not appropriate. I think we should have sort of those kind of vigorous discussions should happen so that people don't feel physically unsafe. But people feel very, very strongly on both sides of the issue, and absolutely, universities ought to be the place to lean into those kinds of discussions, so that we can actually have. I think that's the purpose of universities, actually. Like I heard last couple of days something I looked at as a model of how I heard people on very, very different opinions about what to do about climate, and you all are talking to each other respectfully in a policy forum. That's what universities are for. That's why I wrote that piece about the failure of academic freedom at Stanford. Stanford did not allow that to happen. In fact, I was told explicitly they didn't want that to happen during the pandemic.
So can I jump on this?
Please, Mario.
Something that I observed with great interest. When the presidents of Harvard, University of Pennsylvania, and MIT went to testify at the Senate, a lot of people on the right I wouldn't even say on the right, a lot of Israel supporters were horrified that these presidents could not bring themselves to condemn it depends, is it hate speech, maybe, maybe not, and people were very upset about that. And some people pointed out that the problem with their answer was not that they were technically correct so far as it went. Is it hate speech? It is calling for the destruction of the state of Israel. Is that hate speech? It depends. That's the correct answer. The real problem was that they had canceled as racist, like very mainstream conservative. They had not protected the free speech of mainstream conservative students and speakers in the decade before this, and were suddenly making a principled stand on what a lot of people think of, and I certainly include myself in this, is all of this freedom for justice in Palestine people have fallen for like a really dumb version of Nazi propaganda. And I think that Nazi propaganda is very unfortunate. I think it's very unfortunate that all these students and activists are falling for it. However, I would like us to have just a blanket rule that we allow free speech as long as you're not actually physically threatening somebody or one of these narrow categories of hate speech. And I think that that's a very important point to make, because protecting the free speech rights of students goes hand in hand with protecting freedom of speech generally on campus.
Indeed. So down with Nazi propaganda, up with free speech. So let's do some questions. I figured there would be a bunch here. We have microphones.
I had a strong feeling that this would be the first question.
Yeah, I guess. So I'm sorry, we'll start over here just for geographic reasons, but if you would, please tell us who you are, state your name, and for good questions have question marks at the end.
Michael Buschbacher, I'm just curious for your thoughts on the ways in which similar mechanisms have been used in combating what's known as climate mis and disinformation, and the ways in which there's a different government involvement too, in that there are now a lot of state lawsuits challenging a bunch of energy companies' statements as being misleading speech. Sometimes it's true. For instance, there's a case in Minnesota where one of the claims of misleading speech was like David Koch saying something like, yeah, if we have climate change, it will lead to a greening because there'll be more CO2 for plants to use. I'm just curious for where do you see that going? COVID was sort of a thing that happened and is now in the rearview mirror, but climate is not. And what do you think the lessons are that should be learned for these things that are still with us and present kind of a lasting challenge on this issue?
I mean, I think that the public square should allow the broadest possible set of ideas put forward, true and false. I don't believe, now that I was a pro bono expert witness on a whole bunch of like anti-mask mandate, vax mandate, anti-lockdown cases through the pandemic, several which ended up in front of the Supreme Court. I say this with all due respect, that I don't think the courts are the right place and have the expertise to sort out scientific facts. Some of the judges got it right, some of the judges got it wrong. They were not the right people to judge about these scientific facts. Perfect on the law, but good on the law, but really not so good on the scientific facts. I don't see the harm in allowing people to say things that are wrong. I do see much more the harm in trying to put on top of an apparatus to like root out what's wrong, because they very often root out even what's right. I agree with J.S. Mill. When someone says a wrong thing, the correction of that wrong thing actually instructs the public, and it helps the public. And so that's where my philosophical bent was before the pandemic. And I want to apply it pretty broadly.
Yeah, just a quick jump in on that point before going to Professor Phil Stoddard's question. Is that I forgot what your question was. Sorry.
Climate misinformation lessons.
So I will say that we've heard Senator Torquemada, Sheldon Whitehouse, going on about how wanting to persecute climate deniers and so forth, and I'll just say that that's very hard to take seriously, because all of the major obstacles to a clean energy transition and to climate policy are on the left. Right? It's the left that blocks permitting reform that you would need for clean energy deployment. Right? I mean, it's the left that does. So take as an example the suspension of new LNG licenses, which, by the way, I categorically disagree with you that it will have no effect. We can talk about that later. But Europe is not getting the LNG that it desperately needs today. and was looking forward to and counting on rapidly increasing LNG exports, and as a result of not getting them, electricity prices are going to stay 3 times as high in Europe as they were 4 years ago. The public in Europe is turning increasingly against climate action, and they're going to be forced to burn coal, which is more carbon emission. The suspension of LNG stuff was done in order to placate like the 19-year-olds in the Biden administration's political base. It's a very important constituency. But from the point of view of climate policy, it is totally counterproductive to the goal of climate action and clean energy transition in literally every way that you can think of, right? And so I would say that Senator Torquemada better be careful with that boomerang that he sends floating around, because it might come back to strike lots of people on his own side. Anyway.
We can debate this point offline, but by the way, gas prices in Europe are now lower than they were before Russia attacked Ukraine.
But they are still 3 times higher than they were in 2019.
So not related to, the 2021 was when gas was cut off actually by Russia, so we can talk back to that. I'm sorry, Professor Phil, our guide to Tamiami Hall. I don't think I would have made it here without your leadership.
Nice, I'm glad you made it.
Thank you.
First of all, I just want to say I'm fundamentally sympathetic to your situation and point of view. I've been a bit of an iconoclast in a number of scientific fields, and it can be very a lot of work to go against the establishment, even when you're right. It's worth doing. It's worth doing. Now, my take is sort of what got you crosswise with the medical establishment was sort of under the shouting fire in a theater doctrine of the exception to the First Amendment. But I went back in preparation for your talk and reread the Great Barrington Declaration. And I counted like 7 things in it which I think would definitely want to be updated today. One of which you even repeated today, which is that there's a 1,000-fold difference between
more like 10,000 now.
You said a thousandfold difference in risk of death. It's actually 2,000-fold, but it's only between the youngest and folks over 85. Once you get below the 85 and older group, which I'm a member, it definitely drops below 1,000. But there's nuances. The issue about herd immunity. At the time, the discussion was we're really hoping for herd immunity, but we don't know if the wretched virus is going to mutate and break us on that. Turns out it did. And so, again, we could have a more nuanced discussion. In the Great Barrington Declaration, the definition wasn't the one that I normally use, which is getting R naught below 1.0. It was a level of, even level of transmission.
Sorry, definition
but
of
my
what?
question for you, I got a question. And that is that, and I think if you had framed the Declaration as a questioning document rather than sort of as a policy document, the reception would have been different. So my question for you today is, if you were to update that document, it's like do a modern analysis with the wisdom of hindsight, what we've learned about this virus, which is quite a lot since that originally came out, how would you, what nuances would you add? What concessions would you make? How would you update that document, if you were to do an analysis today? I think that would be a wonderful thing to look at. Sort of what did we know back then? What did we not know? What assumptions were being made on the different policy sides, and the questions that you really would have liked to have asked, with 5 years of information behind you.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and thank you for the question and the comments. So on the question of risk, the 1,000-fold first, the Great Barrington Declaration is a document aimed at the public, right? As you said, it's a policy document. Our goal was to tell the public there was a scientific debate. And in fact, in conversations I had in podcasts, you can go back and look, what we really wanted was a engagement with public health to think better how to protect vulnerable older people, because we thought they were not doing a good job. That was the primary thing. We wanted to start a discussion, and I did not anticipate the kind of incredible counter-reaction we got. I anticipated an engagement with public, because it's going to be very different in Mumbai than it is going to be in South Central LA than it is going to be in right around here. The elderly population lives in a very different way in each of those places, and so the public health policies for those places to better protect vulnerable people is going to require things that I had which I really am a fringe epidemiologist in that sense. I don't know what people live like here. I don't know what people live like in Mumbai. I need the public health authorities in those places to engage creatively, to think how to creatively protect those vulnerable. That's the conversation I thought we were going to start. The reaction was essentially like there was a paper in the Lancet, for instance, co-signed by the former head of the CDC, essentially with saying there's possible that there was no immunity after COVID recovery. It's just scientifically false thing, and that was known at the time. There were plenty of papers in Cell and Nature documenting immunity. The question of like, is the classic herd immunity model, with 1 minus 1 over R naught, is that the right way to think about coronavirus? That's a really good question. I mean, that we simplified that, but I knew at the time what coronavirus herd immunity looks like. It's not permanent. It phases in and out. You can go, and as we've seen, you get continual waves. That's what endemicity looks like. We're kind of headed there, right? Maybe we're already there. It looked like to me that was the end point of the pandemic. That's what we were trying to get across. Maybe we didn't get it across as elegantly.
But wasn't the debate at the time about, I remember it as being about flattening the curve so we didn't overwhelm the ERs. And they said, everybody was saying, look, this thing, you flatten the curve, you're just going to prolong the period of high infection rates. That's what everybody was saying. But they said we need to do that anyway, even at the cost of society, because we can't risk over-flooding the ER. So let's flatten the curve and just push this thing out longer. And we all went, oh God, no. It's like, is that the cost we have to pay?
You're referring to 2 weeks to stop the spread?
No, they were saying you smush those curves flat, and you're going to be looking at 4 months of infection or 6 months of infection. It was horrible, but we understood what they were trying to accomplish, and it was to avoid overwhelming the ERs and losing everybody who went in. That was what the rationale was, and they were very clear about that. It was kind of a horrifying specter, and we all had to live through that.
I think so. Like just the timeline. That was the argument in March of 2020. That was a justification given. In October of 2020, we wrote it. The argument actually was given was that we're done with lockdowns. We just come through a summer where the disease had been, people were like declaring victory. But I was looking at, and my colleagues were looking at the epidemic curves, and it was really clear that we had not had victory, that the disease was coming back, and I was afraid that the lockdowns were also going to come back. That's the major reason we wrote it at the time we wrote it. And the lockdown, this is one thing I think that our opponents got tremendously wrong. They vastly underestimated the harms of the lockdown and the inefficacy of the lockdown in most of the world. They didn't understand that the lockdowns, I think of it as a luxury of the laptop class. That's who actually potentially could benefit from that. We're all a class of Howard Hughes that we can, hide ourselves in some mansion away from the rest of the world, whereas most of the rest of the world just had to keep going. So that I think we got right, and much of the scientific response to it tried to elide that fact, tried to suppress the idea that we're going to be harmed to children from closing schools for so long. We were trying to prevent lockdowns. That was the primary reason, and then secondarily, both actually, equally, both planks, protect vulnerable elderly people better, given that we knew that lockdowns had already failed to protect them during the first wave of the pandemic.
But I think also, if I can jump in, it's important to distinguish between. It's very interesting to relitigate and debate what climate policy should have been at different points in time. But what we're trying to highlight here is whether Dr. J was correct or not in what he was saying in the Great Barrington Declaration. It was censored, and the people who signed it were persecuted.
No, but he agreed with that. He said
perhaps. I understand.
The question was more along the lines of why.
So here's the thing about the censorship that I'm curious about. I'm just thinking that if it had been written less as a declaration and more as a question document, if it would have evoked less of a visceral reaction on the part of the public health officials. I think it probably would have. It was pretty, it was a line in the sand kind of document rather than say, hey, we got some unresolved issues here that have real important, societal importance here that need to be continually rethought.
Like part of it was, there were these UN reports that had come out in April and May 2020 saying that 130 million people were going to starve because of the economic dislocation for the lockdowns in the poor countries. The World Bank issued a report that there were going to be additional 100 million people thrown into dire $2 a day less income poverty. It seemed like an emergency to me to prevent that. And so I didn't, you can look at my career. I'd never, before 2020, March 2020, I'd never written an op-ed. I just published scientific papers. And all of a sudden I was thrown into this maelstrom where I didn't, and everyone on earth seemed like they were contacting me about this. It felt like I had no choice. Like whatever consequences there were to my own career, I had to tell people there were scientists that disagreed on what I still view as the most destructive public health policy in my lifetime.
Well, and I feel very lucky because I keep trying to get censored and nothing works.
Foreign policy is here to help, Mario. That was a fantastic discussion. I just want to make sure we didn't leave any unanswered questions. It doesn't seem we maybe have to. Oh my goodness, we're kind of tight for time, Mario. It's a quarter to 2. Why don't we do this? Can we hear all 3 questions all at once, and we'll take that yours as well?
Yeah.
Just super quick, on the lockdowns, it strikes me we have this COVID hangover with educational loss, mental health loss. Were the models just off on the social isolation? I'm not a scientist, but I just know there's going to be massive educational loss, massive inequity, massive deaths of despair. Just want to on that.
What do the models say? I'm sorry. Let's take all the questions all at once.
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead,
Yeah, I'm going to take it to the low and to the inside. What I related to when we talk about censorship, I'm big and I'm probably a lot different and unique when I come to talk about educating the inner community or the inland community on climate justice. And one of the motivating factors is the health issue, particularly with women with cancer and my seniors, my HOA, sickle cell. So in our efforts as mothers and as nurses and as a few other folks that are technicians, we found that there's a crisis going on that nobody wants to speak about. So I'd like to ask you later on, maybe not a question, but how did you cope? What were some of the reporting or journalism networking or tactics that you utilized? I know you didn't stop talking. And you guys don't want to stop talking now, so we'll talk about that later.
Let's compare notes afterwards. I'd love to.
Let's do
I would love to.
Yeah.
Great stories. Thank you.
Okay, that's a really good question.
And as somebody who loves universities and expert debate, I just wonder if you do have any ideas about what we can do to restore the faith of the public in academics and experts.
That's another excellent question. There's faith still. Why don't we start first, though, with a discussion around the models on lockdowns.
Okay, I'll be very quick. And so just the idea that the lockdowns were going to cause tremendous harm to the poor, we knew that. I knew that on March 16, 2020, when I first heard of the lockdowns. I had an argument with my boss over exactly this point, and there was a Reuters article I got where the question was how many children were going to be abused when we closed schools that weren't going to get picked up. How much domestic abuse was there going to be? The social science literature on this was absolutely convincing. There wasn't any doubt about that. On what we can do, have more things like this really polite conversation we just had about the Great Barrington Declaration. Stanford didn't allow that to happen during the pandemic, and yet FIU is allowing that to happen. That's how we make progress. We talk to each other, we disagree with each other, and we learn from each other. Universities have to be the place where that happens, because nowhere else really has that kind of mission.
Go FIU.
And I'll jump in on just real quick response to your James. I think that it's one of these. One of the things that struck me about the supposed pre-war intelligence failure on Iraq is that people were saying, oh, it looked like the Bush administration politicized the intel. But if you actually read George Tenet's book, Through the Storm, or whatever that thing is called, the biography of all of this, he was CIA director at the time, it becomes clear, it was staggering to me that actually, why is George Tenet weighing in on all these policy issues? And it was actually the risk assessment guy that couldn't resist the temptation of getting in on the risk management side, which was not his job, right? And so it was really the intel became politicized from within because George Tenet had an agenda, and that's the same thing that we see. And the criticism goes both ways because I'm not a pandemic health expert, but I play one at National Review from time to time, and with my former White House colleague Joel Zinberg, who is a physician, a surgeon, professor of surgery, and general counsel was a chief counsel at Council of Economic Advisors when I was at CEQ at the White House. We wrote an article in August of 2020 2020 saying, I was very worried that schools would not reopen on time in September. And I don't have school-age kids, didn't have any kids at that time, but the point that I was making is, why, of course, okay, this is a state decision and everything, but you've got the CDC saying one thing and the president's not saying anything. And it seemed to me that there was a crucial role for the White House as a political function to devise some guidelines for schools to reopen, conditions-based school reopening, based on the CDC chart of like high transmission, low transmission. There were different supposed lockdown stuff. And we never got that. And what I feel like we had was, again, like the politicians whose job it was to make these decisions, hiding behind the skirts of risk assessment experts that's not their job. The CDC's job is not school policy. And so I think that it's, leave to Caesar's what is Caesar's and so forth. And I think that one way to reestablish both the people's trust in politicians and the people's trust in public health officials is for those people to do what their actual jobs are.
On that note, great discussion. Thank you so much, Dr. J. Appreciate it. Mario, thank you. Great selection.
Thank you very much.